It was a peaceful and beautiful day in the big church. The guests sat quietly in their seats, waiting for the wedding to begin. The long aisle was decorated with flowers, their soft colors making everything look magical. The air smelled sweet, like roses and candles, mixed with the clean, polished scent of the wooden pews. The light from the tall windows made the church glow, adding to the special feeling in the room. At the back of the church stood Isabel, the bride. She looked stunning in her ivory wedding gown, which had a long, shiny train that rustled softly as she moved. Her hands held a bouquet of fresh flowers, and her heart beat quickly in her chest. She was excited, but also a little nervous. This was the most important day of her life. She was about to marry the man she loved, and she was happy. Isabel took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, and smiled. Just as the music was about to start, something unexpected happened. Bang! The doors at the back of the church flew open with a loud noise, making everyone jump. The happy whispers of the guests stopped immediately, and all heads turned toward the entrance. A girl stood there, soaked from head to toe. Her hair was wet and stuck to her pale face, and her clothes were torn and messy. She was breathing heavily as if she had been running. Water dripped onto the floor around her as she looked around the church with wide, frightened eyes. Finally, her gaze stopped on Isabel. "You don't know who you're about to marry," the girl shouted, her voice loud and clear. The guests gasped. Murmurs started to spread across the room as people whispered to each other. "Who is she? What's going on? Is this some kind of joke?" But one look at the girl's face told everyone this was no joke. Her expression was serious, almost desperate. She was shaking from the cold, her wet clothes clinging to her as she stepped further into the church. Isabel froze. Her hands gripped her bouquet tightly, and her heart raced. She didn't understand what was happening, but something about the girl's wild, determined eyes made her feel uneasy. It was as if the air in the church had changed. Everything felt heavier, like the moment itself was holding its breath. The girl spoke again, her voice steadier this time, but still filled with emotion. "You don't know who you're about to marry." Isabel's mind spun with questions. Who was this girl? What did she mean? And why did Isabel feel like something terrible was about to happen? The girl's name was Zoe. She was only 16 years old, but her life had been harder than most people could imagine. She had no home, no family, and no one to care for her. Zoe lived on the streets, where every day was a struggle to survive. She hadn't always been alone. Zoe used to have a family, a loving mother and father. She remembered her mom's warm smile and her dad's strong hugs. She remembered the smell of homemade dinners and the sound of laughter filling their little house. But all of that was taken from her one terrible night when a car accident claimed her parents' lives. After the accident, Zoe was sent to live with strangers in foster homes. Some of them were kind, but many weren't. She felt like no one really wanted her. By the time she turned 14, Zoe had had enough. She ran away, choosing the hard life of the streets over a system that didn't care about her. Living alone was scary at first, but Zoe was smart and resourceful. She learned how to find food, where to sleep safely, and how to avoid danger. Sometimes she had to beg for money or steal, even though she hated doing it. It wasn't easy, but Zoe kept going because she had no other choice. Even though her life was tough, Zoe held on to one tiny spark of hope. She dreamed that maybe, just maybe, there was someone out there who cared about her, someone who would love her like her parents had. That small hope kept her moving forward, even on her worst days. One rainy afternoon, Zoe was sitting on some steps, trying to stay dry, when she saw a man walking by with a beautiful woman. The man was tall and confident, with striking blue eyes. He held the woman's hand and looked at her like she was the most important person in the world. Zoe stared at him, her heart pounding. She recognized him. The man was Max. Zoe's mother had once shown her a picture of Max, though she hadn't told her much about him. Zoe's mom and Max had been in love a long time ago, before Zoe was born. But Max had never known about Zoe. Her mother had kept it a secret. After her mom died, Zoe had spent years trying to learn more about Max. She searched through old photos, asked questions, and followed every clue she could find. Finally, she had found him. Now here he was, walking past her with Isabel, looking happy and successful. Zoe's chest tightened. She felt angry and hurt. While she had been struggling to survive on the streets, Max had been living a comfortable life. He didn't even know she existed. It wasn't fair. Zoe decided she needed to confront him. She followed Max and Isabel to the church, her heart pounding with every step. At first, she just wanted to talk to him, to tell him the truth. But when she saw Isabel standing in her beautiful dress, surrounded by flowers and smiling so brightly, something inside Zoe snapped. She wasn't just sad or angry anymore. She needed the truth to come out. Now, standing in the middle of the church aisle, Zoe took a deep breath. Her whole body was shaking, but she didn't back down. "You don't know who you're about to marry," she said again, her voice echoing through the silent church. Isabel's face turned pale. She looked at Max, then back at Zoe. The guests whispered nervously, trying to figure out what was going on. Zoe's eyes stayed on Max. He still looked confused, like he didn't recognize her. That hurt more than anything else. "I'm your daughter," Zoe finally said, her voice breaking. "I've spent my whole life wondering who you were, and now I find you here, about to get married, like I never even existed." The church erupted into chaos. People gasped, and the whispers turned into loud chatter. Max's face turned white as he stared at Zoe, trying to process her words. Isabel looked at Max, her eyes full of questions. "Is this true?" she asked softly. Max opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at Zoe, then at Isabel, then back at Zoe again. Zoe felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She had waited her whole life for this moment. She wasn't going to let it slip away. "This is the truth," Zoe said, her voice steady now. "You're my father, and I've been alone for so long because you never knew. I deserve answers. I deserve to know why." The church fell silent again. Everyone waited to see what Max would say. For Zoe, this was more than just a dramatic moment. It was the beginning of a story that had been hidden for years. And no matter how it ended, she knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't be invisible anymore. Isabel stood quietly in front of the big mirror in the back room of the church, staring at herself in her wedding dress. It was the most beautiful dress she had ever worn, made of soft lace and shiny satin that flowed all around her like a princess's gown. The top of the dress sparkled in the light, and the long skirt spread out around her like a magical cloud. Her golden hair was curled perfectly, and her cheeks glowed with happiness. Today was her wedding day, the day she had dreamed of for so long. She was going to marry Max, the man she loved so much, the man who promised her a life full of joy and luxury. Isabel took a deep breath, her fingers brushing against the soft lace of her dress. Everything felt perfect, like a fairy tale come true. But deep down, she felt a tiny flicker of worry, a little voice in her head that whispered doubts. "It's normal," she told herself. "Everyone feels nervous on their wedding day." She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to push those feelings away. She reminded herself that she loved Max, and Max loved her. That was all that mattered. Outside, the weather wasn't so perfect. The sky was gray, and rain poured down in heavy sheets, soaking everything it touched. Zoe stood outside the church, hidden in the shadow of the grand archway at the entrance. Her clothes were wet and clung to her like a second skin, and her hair stuck to her face in messy strands. She shivered in the cold, but her heart was pounding too hard for her to notice. Zoe had been waiting for this day for so long. She had traveled so far and searched for so many years to find Max. And now she was finally here, standing outside the doors of the beautiful church where he was about to get married. Her hands trembled as she stared at the big wooden doors, but doubt filled her mind. What if no one believed her? What if they thought she was lying? What if they threw her out before she could say what she needed to say? She took a deep breath and told herself she couldn't turn back now. She had to do this. She had to tell the truth. After everything she had been through, she couldn't just walk away. Summoning all her courage, she pushed open the heavy church doors. Inside, the church was breathtaking. Flowers decorated every bench, and their sweet scent filled the air. The soft music of a string quartet drifted through the room, making everything feel magical. The guests, all dressed in their fanciest clothes, sat on the benches, whispering to one another as they waited for the bride to walk down the aisle. As Zoe stepped inside, the music continued, but every head turned to look at her. Her boots echoed on the shiny marble floor, and her wet clothes dripped little puddles of water as she walked. The guests whispered to each other, their voices confused. Who is she? Why is she here? Was she invited? Even Isabel, who had been glowing with happiness moments before, froze when she saw Zoe. She turned away from the mirror, her eyes wide with shock. Her beautiful wedding dress seemed to shimmer as she took a step back, unsure of what was happening. Max was standing near the altar, waiting for the ceremony to begin. When he saw Zoe, his face turned pale. His eyes widened as he stared at her, and his confident expression vanished. He looked completely stunned. Zoe ignored the whispers and stares. She kept walking, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst out of her chest. She stopped in the middle of the aisle, turned to face everyone, and said loudly, "You don't know who you're marrying." The entire room went silent. The music stopped. Every pair of eyes was on Zoe, and the tension in the air was so thick it was hard to breathe. Isabel's mouth opened like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. She stood frozen, looking at Zoe and then at Max, her face filled with confusion. Max looked like a statue, his mouth slightly open as if he was about to speak, but no sound came. Zoe took a deep breath, her hands shaking but her voice steady. "Max," she said, looking directly at him, "you don't know me, but I know you. I've been looking for you for years." A wave of gasps swept through the crowd. The guests began whispering again, their faces full of shock and curiosity. Who was this girl? Why was she here? What was she talking about? Isabel turned to Max, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is she saying? Max, do you know her?" Zoe's voice grew stronger as she continued. "I'm your daughter," she said, her words cutting through the whispers like a sharp knife. "You don't recognize me, but you knew my mother. Her name was Anna. You had a relationship with her a long time ago, and because of that—" She paused, her voice trembling. "I was born." The room fell silent again. Everyone stared at Zoe, then at Max, then back at Zoe. The guests looked at each other, unsure of what to do or say. Max's face turned even paler, and he stumbled back a step. His eyes were wide with disbelief, and his hands trembled as if he didn't know what to do. Isabel's face, which had been glowing with happiness just moments before, was now pale and filled with confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Your daughter? How can that be?" Zoe swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "After my mom passed away, I was given up for adoption," she said. "You didn't even know I existed, did you? You built this perfect life for yourself, but you left me with nothing. I grew up without a family, without love, because of you." The guests began whispering louder, their voices a mix of shock and curiosity. The once beautiful wedding was now a storm of confusion and tension. Everyone was waiting for Max to explain himself, to say something, anything, to make sense of what was happening. But Max didn't say a word. He just stood there, frozen, as the weight of Zoe's words sank in. Isabel turned to Max, her hands trembling as she grabbed the edge of her dress. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Max, tell me this isn't true." Max opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His perfectly polished suit, his charming smile, none of it mattered now. The truth was out, and he couldn't hide from it anymore. Zoe stood tall, even though her heart was pounding in her chest. "This wedding," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "This life you're building, it's all based on lies. And I'm here to tell the truth. You abandoned me, Max. You left me behind. I've been waiting for this moment to tell you for years." The guests were stunned. Some of them looked at Zoe with pity, others with disbelief, and a few even glared at Max, their expressions full of judgment. Isabel's face crumpled with sadness. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at Max, then at Zoe, trying to figure out what to believe. "Max," she said again, her voice trembling, "is it true?" Max didn't answer. He just stood there, his head bowed, his hands clenched into fists. The room was silent, except for the sound of rain tapping against the church windows. Zoe took a step closer to Max, her voice softening but still firm. "You can't run away from this anymore," she said. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. You need to face what you've done." The room was filled with tension so thick it felt like time had stopped. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone knew one thing. Nothing would ever be the same. Zoe stood at the front of the church, her hands trembling, her heart pounding loudly in her chest. She had spent years searching for this moment, years wondering if she would ever find the man who was supposed to be her father. Now that she was here, it felt like all the words she had practiced were stuck in her throat, but she had to say them. She couldn't hold back anymore. She took a shaky breath and looked straight at Max, the man standing at the altar in his suit. "I've been searching for you for so long," Zoe said, her voice cracking. "I've been trying to find my dad, but when I finally did, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe the life you've built for yourself. I couldn't believe the man you've become." Max's face froze. He looked confused and scared all at once. Normally, he always seemed calm and in control, but not today. His hand reached up to tug at his tie, like it was suddenly too tight. But it wasn't the tie making him feel like he couldn't breathe. It was the truth. He stared at Zoe, his eyes wide and filled with something she couldn't quite name. Was it guilt? Was it regret? Maybe it was both. Isabel, the woman Max was about to marry, stood nearby in her white wedding dress. Her eyes darted between Zoe and Max, trying to understand what was happening. Just moments ago, she had been ready to say "I do" to the man she loved. Now everything felt upside down. "What's going on?" Isabel whispered mostly to herself. Her voice was quiet, shaky. Max tried to speak, but his words came out as a stammer. This can't be true," he said, looking at Zoe. His voice sounded different, weaker than before. "I didn't know. I had no idea you even existed. I didn't know." Zoe shook her head, her eyes full of tears. "You knew," she said firmly. "You knew Mom was pregnant. You knew you had a child, but you never came for me. You didn't even try. And now, here you are, standing at the altar about to marry someone else, acting like I don't exist, acting like my mom didn't matter." Her voice cracked, and for a moment she had to stop talking to catch her breath. "You didn't care enough to look for me," Zoe continued, "and now you've built this perfect life without me in it, without even thinking about what you left behind." Max's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He turned away from her for a moment, trying to keep calm, but it wasn't working. The truth, the one he had been hiding from for so long, was finally catching up with him. The guests sitting in the pews of the church started whispering to each other. Some looked shocked, others confused. A few of them just sat there, frozen, not knowing how to react. Isabel, still standing near Max, stepped closer to him. Her hands were shaking. She wanted to believe this wasn't real, that this was all some big misunderstanding. "Max," she said, her voice trembling, "is this true?" Her eyes searched his face, hoping to find some clue that Zoe's words weren't real. But Max couldn't lie anymore. Slowly he nodded, his face pale as a ghost. "It's true," he whispered. "I didn't know she was alive. I didn't know." Isabel felt like her whole world was falling apart. The man she loved, the man she was about to marry, had been keeping a huge secret from her. How could he not tell her something so important? How could he hide a daughter? Isabel's mind raced. She didn't know what to feel, hurt, angry, or just plain sad. She looked at Zoe, who was standing tall, even though her hands were trembling slightly. Zoe's heart was pounding, but at the same time, she felt like a weight was being lifted off her shoulders. She had been scared to confront Max, scared to face him after all these years. But now that she had spoken her truth, she didn't feel invisible anymore. "I'm not here to ruin your wedding," Zoe said, her voice steady even though it wavered a little. "I just need you to understand what you've done. You need to see me. I'm your daughter. I've been out here fighting for my life, wondering why you left me, wondering why you didn't care enough to find me." Max finally looked up at Zoe. His eyes were filled with sadness, regret, and guilt. "I didn't," he started to say, his voice breaking. "I never meant for this to happen. I was young. I was selfish. But I should have been there for you. I should have." Zoe cut him off, shaking her head. "It's too late for apologies now," she said. "I just want you to know what you did. I just want you to know that I'm here." She took a deep breath, her heart still racing, but for the first time she felt a little bit of peace. She had finally told him the truth. She turned to look at Isabel, the bride. Isabel stood frozen, her face a mix of sadness and disbelief. Zoe didn't think Isabel would understand just yet, but maybe one day she would. Zoe turned and started to walk away. Her footsteps echoed loudly in the silent church. The truth was out now, and there was no taking it back. The guests were still whispering to each other. Some of them looked at Zoe with sympathy, while others looked skeptical. No one really knew what to say. Isabel stood at the altar, staring at Max. Her hands were shaking. Just a little while ago, she thought this was going to be the happiest day of her life. Now, everything was falling apart. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and dialed 911. "There's a problem at a wedding," she said shakily when someone answered. "Please send help." She hung up quickly, her eyes darting around the room, unsure of what would happen next. Zoe turned back toward Max one last time. "You're a coward," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You've been hiding behind your money, your success, and your lies. But this is the real world. No more pretending." Max's face turned red, and he opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, but no words came out. He looked completely lost. The church doors opened, and two police officers walked in. The guests gasped and whispered even louder. The officers calmly looked around the room, trying to figure out what was going on. One of them walked over to Isabel. "Are you the bride?" the officer asked gently. "Yes," Isabel said, her voice still shaky. "But there's been a misunderstanding." She glanced nervously at Zoe. The officer looked at Zoe. "What's going on here?" Zoe stood tall, her shoulders back. She wasn't afraid anymore. "I've been trying to find him for years," she said, pointing at Max. "He's my dad, but he never came looking for me. I had to survive on my own while he lived this perfect, rich life. I just want him to know I'm here." The officers exchanged glances, unsure of how to handle the situation. The guests continued to whisper, their eyes darting between Zoe, Max, and the officers. Max stared at Zoe, his face full of regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. Isabel looked between Max and Zoe, her face pale. Everything had changed in just a few minutes, and nothing would ever be the same again. Zoe slowly turned around, her heart racing in her chest. Every step she took toward the door felt heavy, like her feet were made of lead. She didn't know where she was going next, but one thing was clear in her mind. She couldn't stay in that church anymore. Not after everything that had just happened. "Wait," a voice called out behind her, thick with emotion. It was Max. His voice trembled, like he was trying to hold back tears. "Zoe, please don't leave. We really need to talk." Zoe didn't stop. She kept walking, her shoes tapping loudly on the hard floor of the church. Each step felt like it echoed through the empty space, making her feel even more alone than she already did. The church had been so full of life and noise only moments ago, with people talking and laughing, but now it was silent, as if the whole world had paused to watch her leave. She reached the big wooden doors of the church. They were heavy and old, the kind of doors that made a loud sound when they closed. But before she walked out, she turned one last time, just enough to look back at Max and the others. "I'm leaving you my number," Zoe said quietly, her voice steady but firm. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. She scribbled something on it quickly, though her hand shook just a little. She had to leave. This was the only thing she could do now. "It's up to you if you ever want to be a father to me," Zoe continued, her voice a little louder this time, but still soft. "But you've been hiding from it for years. Now it's your turn to face the consequences." Without waiting for an answer, Zoe handed the paper to a nearby officer. The officer took it without a word, not knowing what to say either. Zoe then turned and walked out of the church, the door swinging closed behind her with a loud thud that seemed to echo in the stillness. Inside, everyone was left in stunned silence. The guests, the bride, and especially Max, who was now the man who should have been her father, all stood there in shock. No one knew what to say. It felt like the world had suddenly become a much quieter place. The church, once filled with voices and laughter, now felt like a tomb, quiet and empty, as though it had witnessed the end of something important. The people inside had scattered, walking away in silence, leaving behind only the sound of the heavy door that had just closed. The echoes of the door closing seemed to stretch on forever, sealing the silence in the church. Outside, the storm had calmed down. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, and the wind had stopped howling. The sky was still gray, but there was a quiet kind of peace in the air now, as if the storm had washed away all the chaos. Zoe stood alone on the steps of the church, her eyes focused on the small piece of paper she held in her hand. Her number. That was all she had left to give. She had walked out of the church with only one thing on her mind: to escape. She needed to escape the reality of her past coming face to face with her present. She needed to escape the weight of the truth that had just been forced out into the open. But as she stood there, feeling the cool breeze against her skin, something shifted inside her. She wasn't sure what it was, but it was enough to make her hesitate. She didn't know if she was ready to face the consequences of what had just happened, but standing here, outside in the rain, she felt something, a question, an uncertainty she hadn't expected. Zoe wasn't sure if she was waiting for something, but she wasn't surprised when she heard footsteps coming up behind her. They were quiet at first, not loud, but they grew louder as the person got closer. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze for a moment. Her breath caught in her throat and her chest tightened. She didn't want to turn around. Part of her wanted to stay where she was, to keep the distance. But the footsteps kept coming, and soon she could hear the person just a few feet behind her. Then, the voice she thought she'd never hear again spoke. "Zoe." It was Max. His voice was soft, hesitant, like he didn't want to say the wrong thing. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice thick with the kind of emotion she hadn't heard from him in years. Zoe didn't turn around right away. She wasn't sure if she could face him. Part of her wanted to keep walking, to keep putting distance between herself and the man who had abandoned her. But something made her stop. Slowly, she turned around. Max stood there, drenched from the rain. His suit was soaked through, his hair sticking to his forehead. For a moment, he looked small, vulnerable, almost like a completely different person. Zoe almost didn't recognize him. This wasn't the man who had abandoned her all those years ago. This was a man who was trying, a man who was broken, a man who had finally realized how much he had lost. "I don't even know where to begin," Max said, his voice shaky. "I know there's nothing I can say to make up for what I've done, but I need to start somewhere. I've spent my life running from the truth, and I can't run anymore." Zoe swallowed hard, her lips trembling. She had heard apologies before, empty words from people who had never truly understood the pain she had gone through. But there was something different about Max now. Something in his eyes told her that he was being honest. She wasn't sure if she could believe him, but the man standing before her was different. For the first time, it felt like he understood what he had done. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it made her hesitate. Max crouched down in front of her, his knees not quite touching the ground, but close enough that their eyes were on the same level. "I'm sorry for the life you've had to live," he said, his voice cracking, "for everything you had to go through alone." A single tear slipped down his cheek. "I was a coward," he continued. "I should have come for you. I should have known you were out there. I should have. Why didn't you?" Zoe's voice cracked, filled with years of unanswered questions. "Why didn't you come for me? Why did I have to grow up in foster homes in the streets fighting to survive while you—" Max's face crumpled, the weight of her words hitting him hard. His shoulders slumped, like they couldn't hold up the burden of the guilt he was feeling. I was scared," he whispered, barely above a breath. "I thought I could put it all behind me. I thought it would be easier to forget and move on. But that was the biggest mistake of my life." Zoe stared at him, trying to make sense of what was happening. For years, she had imagined this moment. She had dreamed about confronting him, about demanding answers. She thought it would be full of rage, of anger. But as she stood there now, looking at him, she didn't feel that anger. There was something else, something raw and painful. It was a shared pain, but one that was too tangled to fully understand yet. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Max," she said quietly, her voice shaking with emotion. "I've had to live with this hole in my life that you left behind. I don't even know who you are anymore." Max nodded slowly, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I know," he said, "and I don't expect you to forgive me. Not now. But I want to be part of your life, Zoe. Not just as a father who writes checks, but as someone who can help you, someone who can try to make it right." He hesitated, his hands trembling as he reached out slightly. "I've been wrong about so many things, but I'm not the same man I was back then." Zoe's eyes softened just a little. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to take responsibility for everything, not in the way he was doing now. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. He wasn't asking her to forget the past. He was asking her for a chance to be something different. "Why now?" Zoe asked, almost to herself. "Why after all this time?" "Because I was afraid to face you," Max said quietly. "Afraid that I couldn't fix what I had broken. But I don't want to live in fear anymore." His voice was calm now, filled with quiet determination. Zoe took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she admitted, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've had to survive without you for so long. I've learned to trust only myself. I don't know how to trust you." Max nodded again, understanding in his eyes. He didn't argue or try to change her mind. Instead, he simply said, "I'll wait, however long it takes, but I won't give up on you. I won't abandon you again." Zoe stood there for a long time, lost in her thoughts. Her past, the anger, and the hurt seemed to swirl around her like a storm. But as she looked at Max, something inside her shifted. She wasn't sure if she could ever forgive him or if she could ever fully trust him, but maybe, just maybe, there was room for something new, something different. For the first time, Zoe wondered if she could give him the chance he was asking for. Thank you for watching. If you like this story and want to see more, please subscribe to our channel. That way you won't miss any new videos. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and share what you think in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts. Also, don't forget to check out the other videos on our channel. We'll see you in the next story.